50 Famous Stories Retold by James Baldwin. Concerning these stories. There are numerous time-honored stories which have become so incorporated into the literature and thought of our race that a knowledge of them is an indispensable part of one's education. These stories are of several different classes. To one class belong the popular fairy tales which have delighted untold generations of children, and will continue to delight them to the end of time. To another class belong the limited number of fables that have come down to us through many channels from hoar antiquity. To a third belong the charming stories of olden times that are derived from the literatures of ancient peoples, such as the Greeks and the Hebrews. A fourth class includes the half-legendary tales of a distinctly later origin, which have for their subject certain romantic episodes in the lives of well-known heroes and famous men, or in the history of a people. It is to this last class that most of the 50 stories contained in this present volume belong. As a matter of course, some of these stories are better known, and therefore more famous than others. Some have a slight historical value. Some are useful as giving point to certain great moral truths. Others are products solely of the fancy and are intended only to amuse. Some are derived from very ancient sources, and are current in the literature of many lands. Some have come to us through the ballads and folk tales of the English people. A few are of quite recent origin. Nearly all are the subjects of frequent allusions in poetry and prose and in the conversation of educated people. Care has been taken to exclude everything that is not strictly within the limits of probability. Hence, there is here no trespassing upon the domain of the fairy tale, the fable, or the myth. That children naturally take a deep interest in such stories, no person can deny. That the reading of them will not only give pleasure, but will help to lay the foundation for broader literary studies, can scarcely be doubted. It is believed, therefore, that the present collection will be found to possess all educative value which will commend it as a supplementary reader in the middle primary grades at school. It is also hoped that the book will prove so attractive that it will be in demand out of school as well. 50 Famous Stories Retold by James Baldwin. Story 1. King Alfred and the Cakes. Many years ago there lived in England a wise and good king whose name was Alfred. No other man ever did so much for his country as he, and people now, all over the world, speak of him as Alfred the Great. In those days a king did not have a very easy life. There was war almost all the time, and no one else could lead his army into battle so well as he. And so, between ruling and fighting, he had a busy time of it indeed. A fierce, rude people called the Danes had come from over the sea, and were fighting the English. There were so many of them, and they were so bold and strong, that for a time they gained every battle. If they kept on, they would soon be the masters of the whole country. At last, after a great battle, the English army was broken up and scattered. Every man had to save himself in the best way he could. King Alfred fled alone, in great haste through the woods and swamps. Late in the day the king came to the hut of a woodcutter. He was very tired and hungry, and he begged the woodcutter's wife to give him something to eat and a place to sleep in her hut. The woman was baking some cakes upon the hearth, and she looked with pity upon the poor, ragged fellow who seemed so hungry. She had no thought that he was the king. "Yes," she said, "I will give you some supper if you will watch these cakes. I want to go out and milk the cow, and you must see that they do not burn while I am gone." King Alfred was very willing to watch the cakes, but he had far greater things to think about. How was he going to get his army together again? And how was he going to drive the fierce Danes out of the land? He forgot his hunger. He forgot the cakes. He forgot that he was in the woodcutter's hut. His mind was busy making plans for tomorrow. In a little while the woman came back. The cakes were smoking on the hearth. They were burned to a crisp. Ah, how angry she was. "You lazy fellow!" she cried. "See what you have done! You want something to eat, but you do not want to work." I have been told that she even struck the king with a stick, but I can hardly believe that she was so ill-natured. The king must have laughed to himself at the thought of being scolded in this way, and he was so hungry that he did not mind the woman's angry words half so much as the loss of the cakes. I do not know whether he had anything to eat that night, or whether he had to go to bed without his supper, but it was not many days until he had gathered his men together again, and had beaten the Danes in a great battle. End of Story 1. "50 Famous Stories Retold" by James Baldwin. Story 2. King Alfred and the Beggar. At one time the Danes drove King Alfred from his kingdom, and he had to lie hidden for a long time on a little island in a river. One day all who were on the island, except the king and queen and one servant, went out to fish. It was a very lonely place, and no one could get to it except by boat. About noon a ragged beggar came to the king's door and asked for food. The king called the servant and asked, "How much food have we in the house?" "My lord," said the servant, "we have only 1 loaf and a little wine." Then the king gave thanks to God and said, "Give half of the loaf and half of the wine to this poor man." The servant did as he was bidden. The beggar thanked the king for his kindness, and went on his way. In the afternoon the men who had gone out to fish came back. They had 3 boats full of fish, and they said, "We have caught more fish today than in all the other days that we have been on this island." The king was glad, and he and his people were more hopeful than they had ever been before. When night came, the king lay awake for a long time, and thought about the things that had happened that day. At last he fancied that he saw a great light like the sun, and in the midst of the light there stood an old man with black hair, holding an open book in his hand. It may all have been a dream, and yet to the king it seemed very real indeed. He looked and wondered, but was not afraid. "Who are you?" he asked of the old man. "Alfred, my son. Be brave," said the man, "for I am the one to whom you gave this day the half of all the food that you had. Be strong and joyful of heart, and listen to what I say. Rise up early in the morning and blow your horn 3 times, so loudly that the Danes may hear it. By 9 o'clock 500 men will be around you, ready to be led into battle. Go forth bravely, and within 7 days your enemies shall be beaten, and you shall go back to your kingdom to reign in peace." Then the light went out, and the man was seen no more. In the morning the king arose early and crossed over to the mainland. Then he blew his horn 3 times very loudly, and when his friends heard it they were glad, but the Danes were filled with fear. At 9 o'clock 500 of his bravest soldiers stood around him ready for battle. He spoke and told them what he had seen and heard in his dream, and when he had finished they all cheered loudly, and said that they would follow him and fight for him so long as they had strength. So they went out bravely to battle, and they beat the Danes and drove them back to their own place, and King Alfred ruled wisely and well over all his people for the rest of his days. End of Story 2. 50 Famous Stories Retold by James Baldwin. Story 3. King Canute on the Seashore. 100 years or more after the time of Alfred the Great, there was a king of England named Canute. King Canute was a Dane, but the Danes were not so fierce and cruel then as they had been when they were at war with King Alfred. The great men and officers who were around King Canute were always praising him. "You are the greatest man that ever lived," one would say. Then another would say, "O king, there can never be another man so mighty as you." And another would say, "Great Canute, there is nothing in the world that dares to disobey you." The king was a man of sense, and he grew very tired of hearing such foolish speeches. One day he was by the seashore, and his officers were with him. They were praising him, as they were in the habit of doing. He thought that now he would teach them a lesson, and so he bade them set his chair on the beach close to the edge of the water. "Am I the greatest man in the world?" he asked. "Oh, king!" they cried, "there is no one so mighty as you." "Do all things obey me?" he asked. "There is nothing that dares to disobey you, O king," they said. "The world bows down before you and gives you honor." "Will the sea obey me?" he asked, and he looked down at the little waves which were lapping the sand at his feet. The foolish officers were puzzled, but they did not dare to say no. "Command it, O king, and it will obey," said one. "See," cried Canute, "I command you to come no farther. Waves, stop your rolling, and do not dare to touch my feet." But the tide came in, just as it always did. The water rose higher and higher. It came up around the king's chair, and wet not only his feet, but also his robe. His officers stood about him, alarmed, and wondering whether he was not mad. Then Canute took off his crown and threw it down upon the sand. "I shall never wear it again," he said, "and do you, my men, learn a lesson from what you have seen. There is only one king who is all-powerful, and it is he who rules the sea and holds the ocean in the hollow of his hand. It is he whom you ought to praise and serve above all others." End of Story 3. The Sons of William the Conqueror. There was once a great king of England who was called William the Conqueror, and he had 3 sons. One day King William seemed to be thinking of something that made him feel very sad, and the wise men who were about him asked him what was the matter. "I am thinking," he said, "of what my sons may do after I am dead, for unless they are wise and strong, they cannot keep the kingdom which I have won for them. Indeed, I am at a loss to know which one of the 3 ought to be king when I am gone." "O king," said the wise men, "if we only knew what things your sons admire the most, we might be able to tell what kind of men they will be. Perhaps by asking each of them a few questions, we can find out which one of them will be best fitted to rule your palace." "The plan is well worth trying, at least," said the king. "Have the boys come before you, and then ask them what you please." The wise men talked with one another for a little while, and then agreed that the young princes should be brought in, one at a time, and that the same questions should be put to each. The first who came into the room was Robert. He was a tall, willful lad, and was nicknamed Short Stocking. "Fair sir," said one of the men, "answer me this question. If instead of being a boy, it had pleased God that you should be a bird, what kind of bird would you rather be?" "A hawk," answered Robert. "I would rather be a hawk, for no other bird reminds one so much of a bold and gallant knight." The next who came in was young William, his father's namesake and pet. His face was jolly and round, and because he had red hair he was nicknamed Rufus, or the Red. "Fair sir," said the wise man, "answer me this question. If instead of being a boy, it had pleased God that you should be a bird, what kind of a bird would you rather be?" "An eagle," answered William. "I would rather be an eagle, because it is strong and brave. It is feared by all other birds, and is therefore the king of them all." Lastly came the youngest brother, Henry, with quiet steps and a sober, thoughtful look. He had been taught to read and write, and for that reason he was nicknamed Beauclerk, or the handsome scholar. "Fair sir," said the wise man, "answer me this question. If instead of being a boy, it had pleased God that you should be a bird, what kind of a bird would you rather be?" "A starling," said Henry. I would rather be a starling, because it is good-mannered and kind and a joy to every one who sees it, and it never tries to rob or abuse its neighbor." Then the wise men talked with one another for a little while, and when they had agreed among themselves, they spoke to the king. "We find," said they, "that your eldest son Robert will be bold and gallant. He will do some great deeds and make a name for himself, but in the end he will be overcome by his foes and will die in prison. The second son, William, will be as brave and strong as the eagle, but he will be feared and hated for his cruel deeds. He will lead a wicked life and will die a shameful death. The youngest son, Henry, will be wise and prudent and peaceful. He will go to war only when he is forced to do so by his enemies. He will be loved at home and respected abroad, and he will die in peace after having gained great possessions." Years passed away, and the three boys had grown up to be men. King William lay upon his deathbed, and again he thought of what would become of his sons when he was gone. Then he remembered what the wise men had told him, and so he declared that Robert should have the lands which he held in France, that William should be the King of England, and that Henry should have no land at all, but only a chest of gold. So it happened in the end, very much as the wise men had foretold. Robert the Short-stocking was bold and reckless, like the hawk which he so much admired. He lost all the lands that his father had left him, and was at last shut up in prison, where he was kept until he died. William Rufus was so overbearing and cruel that he was feared and hated by all his people. He led a wicked life, and was killed by one of his own men while hunting in the forest. And Henry, the handsome scholar, had not only the chest of gold for his own, but he became, by and by, the King of England, and the ruler of all the lands that his father had had in France. The White Ship. King Henry, the handsome scholar, had one son named William, whom he dearly loved. The young man was noble and brave, and everybody hoped that he would some day be the King of England. One summer Prince William went with his father across the sea to look after their lands in France. They were welcomed with joy by all their people there, and the young prince was so gallant and kind that he won the love of all who saw him. But at last the time came for them to go back to England. The king, with his wise men and brave knights, set sail early in the day, but Prince William with his younger friends waited a little while. They had had so joyous a time in France that they were in no great haste to tear themselves away. Then they went on board of the ship which was waiting to carry them home. It was a beautiful ship with white sails and white masts, and it had been fitted up on purpose for this voyage. The sea was smooth, the winds were fair, and no one thought of danger. On the ship, everything had been arranged to make the trip a pleasant one. There was music and dancing, and everybody was merry and glad. The sun had gone down before the white-winged vessel was fairly out of the bay. But what of that? The moon was at its full, and it would give light enough, and before the dawn of the morrow the narrow sea would be crossed. And so the prince and the young people who were with him gave themselves up to merriment and feasting and joy. The earlier hours of the night passed by, and then there was a cry of alarm on the deck. A moment afterward there was a great crash. The ship had struck a rock. The water rushed in. She was sinking. Ah, where now were those who had lately been so heart-free and glad? Every heart was full of fear. No one knew what to do. A small boat was quickly launched, and the prince with a few of his bravest friends leaped into it. They pushed off just as the ship was beginning to settle beneath the waves. Would they be saved? They had rowed hardly 10 yards from the ship when there was a cry from among those who were left behind. "Row back!" cried the prince. "It is my little sister. She must be saved." The men did not dare to disobey. The boat was again brought alongside the sinking vessel. The prince stood up and held out his arms for his sister. At that moment the ship gave a great lurch forward into the waves. One shriek of terror was heard, and then all was still, save the sound of the moaning waters. Ship and boat, prince and princess, and all the gay company that had set sail from France went down to the bottom together. One man clung to a floating plank, and was saved the next day. He was the only person left alive to tell the sad story. When King Henry heard of the death of his son, his grief was more than he could bear. His heart was broken. He had no more joy in life, and men say that no one ever saw him smile again. Here is a poem about him that your teacher may read to you, and perhaps, after a while, you may learn it by heart. He never smiled again. The bark that held the prince went down, the sweeping waves rolled on, and what was England's glorious crown to him that wept a son? He lived, for life may long be borne ere sorrow breaks its chains. Why comes not death to those who mourn? He never smiled again. There stood proud forms before his throne, the stately and the brave, but who could fill the place of one, that one beneath the wave? Before him passed the young and fair, in pleasure's reckless train, but seas dashed o'er his son's bright hair. He never smiled again. He sat where festal boughs went round, he heard the minstrel sing, he saw the tourney's victor crowned amid the nightly ring. A murmur of the restless deep was blent with every strain, a voice of winds that would not sleep. He never smiled again. Hearts in that time closed o'er the trace of vows once fondly poured, and strangers took the kinsman's place at many a joyous board. Graves which true love had bathed with tears were left to heaven's bright rain. Fresh hopes were born for other years. He never smiled again. Mrs. Hemans. End of Story 5. King John and the Abbot. Part 1. The Three Questions. There was once a king of England whose name was John. He was a bad king, for he was harsh and cruel to his people, and so long as he could have his own way, he did not care what became of other folks. He was the worst king that England ever had. Now, there was in the town of Canterbury a rich old abbot who lived in grand style in a great house called the Abbey. Every day 100 noble men sat down with him to dine, and 50 brave knights, in fine velvet coats and gold chains, waited upon him at his table. When King John heard of the way in which the abbot lived, he made up his mind to put a stop to it, so he sent for the old man to come and see him. "How now, my good abbot," he said, "I hear that you keep a far better house than I. How dare you do such a thing? Don't you know that no man in the land ought to live better than the king? And I tell you that no man shall." "Oh, king," said the abbot, "I beg to say that I am spending nothing but what is my own. I hope that you will not think ill of me for making things pleasant for my friends and the brave knights who are with me." "Think ill of you?" said the king. "How can I help but think ill of you? All that there is in this broad land is mine by right, and how do you dare to put me to shame by living in grander style than I? One would think that you were trying to be king in my place." "Oh, do not say so," said the abbot, "for I—" "Not another word," cried the king. "Your fault is plain, and unless you can answer me 3 questions, your head shall be cut off, and all your riches shall be mine." "I will try to answer them, O king," said the abbot. "Well then," said the king, "as I sit here with my crown of gold on my head, you must tell me to within a day just how long I shall live. Secondly, you must tell me how soon I shall ride round the whole world. And lastly, you shall tell me what I think." "O king," said the abbot, "these are deep, hard questions, and I cannot answer them just now. But if you will give me 2 weeks to think about them, I will do the best that I can." "2 weeks you shall have," said the king, "but if then you fail to answer me, you shall lose your head, and all your lands shall be mine." The abbot went away very sad and in great fear. He first rode to Oxford. Here was a great school called a university, and he wanted to see if any of the wise professors could help him. But they shook their heads, and said that there was nothing about King John in any of their books. Then the abbot rode down to Cambridge, where there was another university, but not one of the teachers in that great school could help him. At last, sad and sorrowful, he rode toward home to bid his friends and his brave knights good-bye, for now he had not a week to live. Part II. The Three Answers. As the abbot was riding up the lane which led to his grand house, he met his shepherd going to the fields. "Welcome home, good master," cried the shepherd. "What news do you bring us from great King John?" "Sad news, said the abbot, and then he told him all that had happened. Cheer up, good master," said the shepherd. "Have you never yet heard that a fool may teach a wise man wit? I think I can help you out of your trouble." "You help me!" cried the abbot. "How? How?" "Well," answered the shepherd, "you know that everybody says that I look just like you, and that I have sometimes been mistaken for you. So lend me your servants and your horse and your gown, and I will go up to London and see the king. If nothing else can be done, I can at least die in your place." "My good shepherd," said the abbot, "you are very, very kind, and I have a mind to let you try your plan. But if the worst comes to the worst, you shall not die for me. I will die for myself." So the shepherd got ready to go at once. He dressed himself with great care. Over the shepherd's coat he threw the abbot's long gown, and he borrowed the abbot's cap and golden staff. When all was ready, no one in the world would have thought that he was not the great man himself. Then he mounted his horse, and with a great train of servants set out for London. Of course the king did not know him. "Welcome, Sir Abbot," he said. "It is a good thing that you have come back. But prompt as you are, if you fail to answer my 3 questions, you shall lose your head." "I am ready to answer them, O king," said the shepherd. "Indeed, indeed," said the king, and he laughed to himself. "Well then, answer my first question. How long shall I live? Come, you must tell me to the very day." "You shall live," said the shepherd, "until the day that you die, and not one day longer. And you shall die when you take your last breath, and not one moment before." The king laughed. "You are witty, I see," he said, "but we will let that pass, and say that your answer is right. And now, tell me how soon I may ride round the world." "You must rise with the sun," said the shepherd, "and you must ride with the sun until it rises again the next morning. As soon as you do that, you will find that you have ridden round the world in 24 hours. The king laughed again. "Indeed," he said, "I did not think that it could be done so soon. You are not only witty, but you are wise, and we will let this answer pass. And now comes my third and last question. What do I think?" "That is an easy question," said the shepherd. "You think that I am the Abbot of Canterbury, but to tell you the truth, I am only his poor shepherd, and I have come to beg your pardon for him and for me." And with that, he threw off his long gown. The king laughed loud and long. "A merry fellow you are," said he, "and you shall be the Abbot of Canterbury in your master's place." "O king, that cannot be," said the shepherd, "for I can neither read nor write." "Very well, then," said the king. "I will give you something else to pay you for this merry joke. I will give you 4 pieces of silver every week as long as you live, and when you get home, you may tell the old abbot that you have brought him a free pardon from King John." End of Story 6. A Story of Robin Hood. In the rude days of King Richard and King John, there were many great woods in England. The most famous of these was Sherwood Forest, where the king often went to hunt deer. In this forest there lived a band of daring men called outlaws. They had done something that was against the laws of the land, and had been forced to hide themselves in the woods to save their lives. There they spent their time in roaming about among the trees, in hunting the king's deer, and in robbing rich travelers that came that way. There were nearly 100 of these outlaws, and their leader was a bold fellow called Robin Hood. They were dressed in suits of green, and armed with bows and arrows, and sometimes they carried long wooden lances and broad swords, which they knew how to handle well. Whenever they had taken anything, it was brought and laid at the feet of Robin Hood, whom they called their king. He then divided it fairly among them, giving to each man his just share. Robin Hood never allowed his men to harm anybody but the rich men who lived in great houses and did no work. He was always kind to the poor, and he often sent help to them, and for that reason the common people looked upon him as their friend. Long after he was dead, men liked to talk about his deeds. Some praised him, and some blamed him. He was, indeed, a rude, lawless fellow, but at that time people did not think of right and wrong as they do now. A great many songs were made up about Robin Hood, and these songs were sung in the cottages and huts all over the land for hundreds of years afterward. Here is a little story that is told in one of these songs. Robin Hood was standing one day under a green tree by the roadside. While he was listening to the birds among the leaves, he saw a young man passing by. This young man was dressed in a fine suit of bright red cloth, and as he tripped gaily along the road, he seemed to be as happy as the day. "I will not trouble him," said Robin Hood, "for I think he is on his way to his wedding." The next day Robin stood in the same place. He had not been there long when he saw the same young man coming down the road, but he did not seem to be so happy this time. He had left his scarlet coat at home, and at every step he sighed and groaned. "Ah, the sad day, the sad day!" he kept saying to himself. Then Robin Hood stepped out from under the tree and said, "I say, young man, have you any money to spare for my merry men and me?" "I have nothing at all," said the young man, "but 5 shillings and a ring." "A gold ring?" asked Robin. "Yes," said the young man, "it is a gold ring. Here it is." "Ah, I see," said Robin. "It is a wedding ring." "I have kept it these 7 years," said the young man. "I have kept it to give to my bride on our wedding day. We were going to be married yesterday, but her father has promised her to a rich old man whom she never saw, and now my heart is broken." "What is your name?" asked Robin. "My name is Allan Adele," said the young man. "What will you give me in gold or fee," said Robin, "if I will help you win your bride again in spite of the rich old man to whom she has been promised?" "I have no money," said Allan, "but I will promise to be your servant." "How many miles is it to the place where the maiden lives?" asked Robin. "It is not far," said Allan, "but she is to be married this very day, and the church is 5 miles away." Then Robin made haste to dress himself as a harper, and in the afternoon he stood in the door of the church. "Who are you?" said the bishop, "and what are you doing here?" "I am a bold harper," said Robin, "the best in the north country." "I am glad to have you come," said the bishop kindly. "There is no music that I like so well as that of the harp. Come in and play for us." "I will go in," said Robin Hood, "but I will not give you any music until I see the bride and bridegroom." Just then an old man came in. He was dressed in rich clothing, but was bent with age, and was feeble and gray. By his side walked a fair young girl. Her cheeks were very pale, and her eyes were full of tears. "This is no match," said Robin. "Let the bride choose for herself." Then he put his horn to his lips and blew 3 times. The very next minute 24 men, all dressed in green, and carrying long bows in their hands, came running across the fields, and as they marched into the church, all in a row, the foremost among them was Allan Adele. "Now whom do you choose?" said Robin to the maiden. "I choose Allan Adele," she said, blushing. "And Allan Adele you shall have," said Robin, "and he that takes you from Allan Adele shall find that he has Robin Hood to deal with." And so the fair maiden and Allan Adele were married then and there, and the rich old man went home in a great rage. And thus having ended this merry wedding, the bride looked like a queen, and so they returned to the merry green wood, amongst the leaves so green. End of Story 7. Bruce and the Spider. There was once a king of Scotland whose name was Robert Bruce. He had need to be both brave and wise, for the times in which he lived were wild and rude. The King of England was at war with him, and had led a great army into Scotland to drive him out of the land. Battle after battle had been fought. 6 times had Bruce led his brave little army against his foes, and 6 times had his men been beaten and driven into flight. At last his army was scattered, and he was forced to hide himself in the woods and in lonely places among the mountains. One rainy day Bruce lay on the ground under a rude shed, listening to the patter of the drops on the roof above him. He was tired and sick at heart, and ready to give up all hope. It seemed to him that there was no use for him to try to do anything more. As he lay thinking, he saw a spider over his head, making ready to weave her web. He watched her as she toiled slowly and with great care. 6 times she tried to throw her frail thread from one beam to another, and 6 times it fell short. "Poor thing," said Bruce, "you too know what it is to fail." But the spider did not lose hope with the 6th failure. With still more care she made ready to try for the 7th time. Bruce almost forgot his own troubles as he watched her swing herself out upon the slender line. Would she fail again? No. The thread was carried safely to the beam and fastened there. "I, too, will try a 7th time," cried Bruce. He arose and called his men together. He told them of his plans, and sent them out with messages of cheer to his disheartened people. Soon there was an army of brave Scotchmen around him. Another battle was fought, and the King of England was glad to go back into his own country. I have heard it said that after that day no one by the name of Bruce would ever hurt a spider. The lesson which the little creature had taught the king was never forgotten. End of Story 8. The Black Douglas. In Scotland, in the time of King Robert Bruce, there lived a brave man whose name was Douglas. His hair and beard were black and long, and his face was tanned and dark, and for this reason people nicknamed him the Black Douglas. He was a good friend of the king, and one of his strongest helpers. In the war with the English who were trying to drive Bruce from Scotland, the Black Douglas did many brave deeds, and the English people became very much afraid of him. By and by the fear of him spread all through the land. Nothing could frighten an English lad more than to tell him that the Black Douglas was not far away. Women would tell their children, when they were naughty, that the Black Douglas would get them, and this would make them very quiet and good. There was a large castle in Scotland, which the English had taken early in the war. The Scottish soldiers wanted very much to take it again, and the Black Douglas and his men went one day to see what they could do. It happened to be a holiday, and most of the English soldiers in the castle were eating and drinking and having a merry time. But they had left watchmen on the wall to see that the Scottish soldiers did not come upon them unawares, and so they felt quite safe. In the evening, when it was growing dark, the wife of one of the soldiers went up on the wall with her child in her arms. As she looked over into the fields below the castle, she saw some dark objects moving toward the foot of the wall. In the dusk, she could not make out what they were, and so she pointed them out to one of the watchmen. "Pooh, pooh," said the watchman, "those are nothing to frighten us. They are farmers' cattle, trying to find their way home. The farmer himself is enjoying the holiday, and he has forgotten to bring them in. If the Douglas should happen this way before morning, he will be sorry for his carelessness." But the dark objects were not cattle. They were the Black Douglas and his men, creeping on hands and feet toward the foot of the castle wall. Some of them were dragging ladders behind them through the grass. They would soon be climbing to the top of the wall. None of the English soldiers dreamed that they were within many miles of the place. The woman watched them until the last one had passed around a corner out of sight. She was not afraid, for in the darkening twilight they looked indeed like cattle. After a little while she began to sing to her child. "Hushie, hushie, little pet ye, hushie, hushie, do not fret ye. The Black Douglas shall not get ye. All at once a gruff voice was heard behind her, saying, "Don't be so sure about that." She looked around, and there stood the Black Douglas himself. At the same moment a Scottish soldier climbed off a ladder and leaped upon the wall, and then there came another, and another, and another, until the wall was covered with them. Soon there was hot fighting in every part of the castle, but the English were so taken by surprise that they could not do much. Many of them were killed, and in a little while the Black Douglas and his men were the masters of the castle, which by right belonged to them. As for the woman and her child, the Black Douglas would not suffer anyone to harm them. After a while they went back to England, and whether the mother made up any more songs about the Black Douglas, I cannot tell. End of Story 9. 3 Men of Gotham. There is a town in England called Gotham, and many merry stories are told of the queer people who used to live there. One day 2 men of Gotham met on a bridge. Hodge was coming from the market, and Peter was going to the market. "Where are you going?" said Hodge. "I am going to the market to buy sheep," said Peter. "Buy sheep?" said Hodge. "And which way will you bring them home?" "I shall bring them over this bridge," said Peter. "No, you shall not," said Hodge. "Yes, but I will," said Peter. "You shall not," said Hodge. "I will," said Peter. Then they beat with their sticks on the ground, as though there had been 100 sheep between them. "Take care," cried Peter. "Look out that my sheep don't jump on the bridge." "I care not where they jump," said Hodge, "but they shall not go over it." "But they will," said Peter. "Have a care," said Hodge, "for if you say too much, I will put my fingers in your mouth." "Will you?" said Peter. Just then another man of Gotham came from the market with a sack of meal on his horse. He heard his neighbors quarreling about sheep, but he could see no sheep between them, and so he stopped and spoke to them. "Ah, you foolish fellows!" he cried. "It is strange that you will never learn wisdom. Come here, Peter, and help me lay my sack on my shoulder." Peter did so, and the man carried his meal to the side of the bridge. "Now look at me," he said, "and learn a lesson." And he opened the mouth of the sack and poured all the meal into the river. "Now, neighbors," he said, "can you tell how much meal is in my sack?" "There is none at all," cried Hodge and Peter together. "You are right," said the man, "and you that stand here and quarrel about nothing have no more sense in your heads than I have meal in my sack." End of Story 10. Other Wise Men of Gotham. One day news was brought to Gotham that the king was coming that way, and that he would pass through the town. This did not please the men of Gotham at all. They hated the king, for they knew that he was a cruel, bad man. If he came to their town, they would have to find food and lodging for him and his men, and if he saw anything that pleased him, he would be sure to take it for his own. What should they do? They met together to talk the matter over. "Let us chop down the big trees in the woods, so that they will block up all the roads that lead into the town," said one of the wise men. "Good," said all the rest. So they went out with their axes, and soon all the roads and paths to the town were filled with logs and brush. The king's horsemen would have a hard time of getting into Gotham. They would either have to make a new road or give up the plan altogether and go on to some other place. When the king came and saw that the road had been blocked up, he was very angry. "Who chopped those trees down in my way?" he asked of the 2 country lads that were passing by. "The men of Gotham," said the lads. "Well," said the king, "go and tell the men of Gotham that I shall send my sheriff into their town, and have all their noses cut off." The 2 lads ran to the town as fast as they could, and made known what the king had said. Everybody was in great fright. The men ran from house to house, carrying the news, and asking one another what they should do. "Our wits have kept the king out of the town," said one, "and so now our wits must save our noses." "True, true," said the others, "but what shall we do?" Then one, whose name was Dobbin, and who was thought to be the wisest of them all, said, Let me tell you something. Many a man has been punished because he was wise, but I have never heard of one being harmed because he was a fool. So when the king's sheriff comes, let us all act like fools." "Good, good!" cried the others. "We will all act like fools." It was no easy thing for the king's men to open the roads, and while they were doing it, the king grew tired of waiting, and went back to London. But very early one morning, the sheriff with a party of fierce soldiers rode through the woods, and between the fields toward Gotham. Just before they reached the town, they saw a queer sight. The old men were rolling big stones up the hill, and all the young men were looking on and grunting very loudly. The sheriff stopped his horses and asked what they were doing. "We are rolling stones uphill to make the sun rise," said one of the old men. "You foolish fellow," said the sheriff. "Don't you know that the sun will rise without any help?" "Ah, will it?" said the old man. "Well, I never thought of that. How wise you are!" "And what are you doing?" said the sheriff to the young men. "Oh, we do the grunting while our fathers do the working," they answered. "I see," said the sheriff. "Well, that is the way the world goes everywhere," and he rode on toward the town. He soon came to a field where a number of men were building a stone wall. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Why, master," they answered, "there is a cuckoo in this field, and we are building a wall around it so as to keep the bird from straying away." "You foolish fellows," said the sheriff. "Don't you know that the bird will fly over the top of your wall, no matter how high you build it?" "Why, no," they said. "We never thought of that. How very wise you are!" The sheriff next met a man who was carrying a door on his back. "What are you doing?" he asked. "I have just started on a long journey," said the man. "But why do you carry that door?" asked the sheriff. "I left my money at home." "Then why didn't you leave the door at home too?" "I was afraid of thieves, and you see, if I have the door with me, they can't break it open and get in." "You foolish fellow," said the sheriff. "It would be safer to leave the door at home and carry the money with you." "Ah, would it though?" said the man. "Now I never thought of that. You are the wisest man that I ever saw." Then the sheriff rode on with his men, but every one that they met was doing some silly thing. "Truly, I believe that the people of Gotham are all fools," said one of the horsemen. "That is true," said another. "It would be a shame to harm such simple people." "Let us ride back to London and tell the king all about them," said the sheriff. "Yes, let us do so," said the horseman. So they went back and told the king that Gotham was a town of fools, and the king laughed, and said that if that was the case, he would not harm them, but would let them keep their noses. End of Story 11. The Miller of the Dee. Once upon a time there lived on the banks of the river Dee a miller, who was the happiest man in England. He was always busy from morning till night, and he was always singing as merrily as any lark. He was so cheerful that he made everybody else cheerful, and people all over the land liked to talk about his pleasant ways. At last the king heard about him. "I will go down and talk with this wonderful miller," he said. "Perhaps he can tell me how to be happy." As soon as he stepped inside of the mill, he heard the miller singing. "I envy nobody, no, not I, for I am as happy as I can be, and nobody envies me." "You're wrong, my friend," said the king. "You're wrong as wrong can be. I envy you, and I would gladly change places with you if I could only be as light-hearted as you are." The miller smiled and bowed to the king. "I am sure I could not think of changing places with you, sir," he said. "Now tell me," said the king, "what makes you so cheerful and glad here in your dusty mill, while I, who am king, am sad and in trouble every day?" The miller smiled again and said, "I do not know why you are sad, but I can easily tell why I am glad. I earn my own bread, I love my wife and my children, I love my friends, and they love me, and I owe not a penny to any man. Why should I not be happy? For here is the river Dee, and every day it turns my mill, and the mill grinds the corn that feeds my wife, my babes, and me. "Say no more," said the King. "Stay where you are and be happy still. But I envy you. Your dusty cap is worth more than my golden crown. Your mill does more for you than my kingdom can do for me. If there were more such men as you, what a good place this world would be. Good-bye, my friend." The King turned about and walked sadly away, and the miller went back to his work, singing, "Oh, I'm as happy can be, for I live by the side of the river Dee." End of Story 12. Sir Philip Sidney. A cruel battle was being fought. The ground was covered with dead and dying men. The air was hot and stifling. The sun shone down without pity on the wounded soldiers lying in the blood and dust. One of these soldiers was a nobleman, whom everybody loved for his gentleness and kindness. Yet now he was no better off than the poorest man in the field. He had been wounded, and would die, and he was suffering much with pain and thirst. When the battle was over, his friends hurried to his aid. A soldier came running with a cup in his hand. "Here, Sir Philip," he said, "I have brought you some clear, cool water from the brook. I will raise your head so that you can drink." The cup was placed to Sir Philip's lips. How thankfully he looked at the man who had brought it! Then his eyes met those of a dying soldier who was lying on the ground close by. The wistful look in the poor man's face spoke plainer than words. "Give the water to that man," said Sir Philip quickly, and then pushing the cup toward him, he said, "Here, my comrade, take this. Thy need is greater than mine." What a brave, noble man he was! The name of Sir Philip Sidney will never be forgotten, for it was the name of a Christian gentleman who always had the good of others in his mind. Was it any wonder that everybody wept when it was heard that he was dead? It is said that on the day when he was carried to the grave, every eye in the land was filled with tears. Rich and poor, high and low, all felt that they had lost a friend. All mourned the death of the kindest, gentlest man that they had ever known. End of Story 13. The Ungrateful Soldier. Here is another story of the battlefield, and it is much like the one I have just told you. Not quite 100 years after the time of Sir Philip Sidney, there was a war between the Swedes and the Danes. One day a great battle was fought, and the Swedes were beaten and driven from the field. A soldier of the Danes who had been slightly wounded was sitting on the ground. He was about to take a drink from a flask. All at once he heard someone say, "Oh, sir, give me a drink, for I am dying." It was a wounded Swede who spoke. He was lying on the ground only a little way off. The Dane went to him at once. He knelt down by the side of his fallen foe and pressed the flask to his lips. "Drink," he said, "for thy need is greater than mine." Hardly had he spoken these words when the Swede raised himself on his elbow. He pulled a pistol from his pocket and shot at the man who would have befriended him. The bullet grazed the Dane's shoulder, but he did not do him much harm. "Ah, you rascal!" he cried. "I was going to befriend you, and you repay me by trying to kill me? Now I will punish you. I would have given you all the water, but now you shall have only half." And with that he drank the half of it, and then gave the rest to the Swede. When the king of the Danes heard about this, he sent for the soldier and had him tell the story just as it was. "Why did you spare the life of the Swede after he had tried to kill you?" asked the king. "Because, sir," said the soldier, "I could never kill a wounded enemy." "Then you deserve to be a nobleman," said the king, and he rewarded him by making him a knight and giving him a noble title. End of Story 14. Sir Humphrey Gilbert. More than 300 years ago there lived in England a brave man whose name was Sir Humphrey Gilbert. At that time there were no white people in this country of ours. The land was covered with forest, and where there are now great cities and fine farms, there were only trees and swamps, among which roamed wild Indians and wild beasts. Sir Humphrey Gilbert was one of the first men who tried to make a settlement in America. Twice did he bring men and ships over the sea, and twice did he fail and sail back for England. The second time he was on a little ship called the Squirrel. Another ship called the Golden Hind was not far away. When they were 3 days from the land, the wind failed, and the ships lay floating on the waves. Then at night the air grew very cold. A breeze sprang up from the east. Great white icebergs came drifting around them. In the morning the little ships were almost lost among the floating mountains of ice. The men on the Hind saw Sir Humphrey sitting on the deck of the Squirrel, with an open book in his hand. He called to them and said, "Be brave, my friends. We are as near heaven on the sea as on the land." Night came again. It was a stormy night, with mist and rain. All at once the men on the Hind saw the lights on board of the Squirrel go out. The little vessel, with brave Sir Humphrey and all his brave men, was swallowed up by the waves. End of Story 15. Sir Walter Raleigh. There once lived in England a brave and noble man whose name was Walter Raleigh. He was not only brave and noble, but he was also handsome and polite, and for that reason the Queen made him a knight and called him Sir Walter Raleigh. I will tell you about it. When Raleigh was a young man, he was one day walking along a street in London. At that time the streets were not paved, and there were no sidewalks. Raleigh was dressed in very fine style, and he wore a beautiful scarlet cloak thrown over his shoulders. As he passed along, he found it hard work to keep from stepping in the mud and soiling his handsome new shoes. Soon he came to a puddle of muddy water which reached from one side of the street to the other. He could not step across. Perhaps he could jump over it. As he was thinking what he should do, he happened to look up. Who was it coming down the street on the other side of the puddle? It was Elizabeth, the Queen of England, with her train of gentlewomen and waiting maids. She saw the dirty puddle in the street. She saw the handsome young man with the scarlet cloak standing by the side of it. How was she to get across? Young Raleigh, when he saw who was coming, forgot about himself. He thought only of helping the Queen. There was only one thing that he could do, and no other man would have thought of that. He took off his scarlet cloak and spread it across the puddle. The Queen could step on it now, as on a beautiful carpet. She walked across. She was safely over the ugly puddle, and her feet had not touched the mud. She paused a moment and thanked the young man. As she walked onward with her train, she asked one of the gentlewomen, "Who is that brave gentleman who helped us so handsomely?" "His name is Sir Walter Raleigh," said the gentlewoman. "He shall have his reward," said the Queen. Not long after that she sent for Raleigh to come to her palace. The young man went, but he had no scarlet cloak to wear. Then, while all the great men and fine ladies of England stood around, the Queen made him a knight, and from that time he was known as Sir Walter Raleigh, the Queen's favorite. Sir Walter Raleigh and Sir Humphrey Gilbert, about whom I have already told you, were half-brothers. When Sir Humphrey made his first voyage to America, Sir Walter was with him. After that, Sir Walter tried several times to send men to this country to make a settlement. But those whom he sent found only great forests and wild beasts and savage Indians. Some of them went back to England. Some of them died for want of food, and some of them were lost in the woods. At last, Sir Walter Raleigh gave up trying to get people to come to America. But he found two things in this country which the people of England knew very little about. One was the potato. The other was tobacco.